Hi folks, Harry Frank from Red Giant here, kicking off afx217, After Effects Red Giant in broadcast design. Now over the next 10 weeks, we'll be covering a great amount of broadcast design, and what we're going to be focusing on is a graphics package that uses the basic 4 elements, wind, fire, earth, and water, as a design motif. So we'll be creating a number of IDs that just sort of explore this idea of, well, earth or perhaps wind, fire, that kind of thing. And this is perfect for a lot of Red Giant tools, specifically the Trapcode suite. And we'll be focusing a great deal on the Trapcode suite in terms of making all kinds of things, either fire or water or that kind of thing. So in my original description, I said that we're going to explore style frames and going through prepping assets and all that kind of stuff. And I actually think that's kind of boring. So I wanted to dive right into this because I planned week 2 to cover both the basics of Trapcode form and particular, which I think is a bit much. So I'd like to dive in and start covering Trapcode form. Now, I realize we have probably a mixed bag of people taking this class, so I need to sort of start with some of the basics. I'm going to move quickly, but I do have to sort of start from kind of the ground and work our way up. So I do have to start at the ground level and kind of work our way up. But like I said, I'll try to move quickly, and if you get lost, keep up with me, and if you really get lost, ask questions in the forums, and I'll be there to help. So we'll be covering Trapcode form because, like I said, it's a very flexible and powerful organic shape generator, and it generates shapes using particles. So that said, really all it is a particle system. So let's just make a new comp here in After Effects using your favorite composition settings. And because Trapcode form is an effect, we have to create a solid to apply it to, and go to Trapcode form and apply Trapcode form. Also make sure we've got a camera in here. Now, the challenge for me is there's so much free training out there that other people have done, and especially that I've done, that cover a lot of these topics. So the challenge to me is to introduce topics to you that don't overlap with what you can get for free because, well, you're here for FX PhD and you're, this isn't free. So I'm going to try to cover a lot of stuff that I haven't gone through in a whole lot of detail, or pull together things into one spot to make things that much more convenient and easy to learn, and sort of an A to Z guide for form. So like I said, form is a 3-dimensional particle system. So with its default settings, if I just rotate one of the settings here, the parameters, the Y rotation, we can see that if I make the particles in X much fewer in number, and we zoom our camera in, we just have particles. And in fact, you'll see this as sort of a repeating theme through a lot of Trapcode plugins. 3D stroke is all particles. Obviously particular, which is a particle system, is all particles, and form is all particles as well. You'll see a lot of overlap in how things behave between these 3 plugins that I just mentioned. Now, one of the very common ways I describe form is like this. When we have a particle system, generally we think of a particle system like Trapcode particular. Let me spell this correctly. Let's go to Trapcode particular. And I don't even need to change any settings here. We think of a particle system like this. We have a point or an area which particles start. They're born from this point, they do something, like they move away from that point of birth, and then at some point, around the 3-second mark, because that's the default lifespan, they disappear because they die. So they're born, they do something, they die. So what we concern ourselves with are individual particle settings of how they're affected by turbulence and wind and gravity and all that kind of stuff. Things that are finite, because if I have gravity or wind, it's going to push this off the screen, and at some point this particle is not going to be visible anymore, and we're not going to worry about it. So it sort of has a finite lifespan, and that's just how particle systems pretty much work. Except for trapcode form. Form doesn't work this way. All of the particles have no lifespan. There's no emitter. They are there forever, as long as the comp is open. So rather than concern ourselves with individual settings that, or individual particles that are affected by things like gravity or wind or whatever, we think about the whole body of particles. So let's start to do sort of a basic overview and sort of a look ahead of what the types of things we'll be doing with trapcode form. So I'm going to just squeeze this down to one set of particles in Z. So we just have that one sheet of particles. Now, in our particle section here, now if you're still kind of new to form, I was very careful to say in the base form we define the shape and we define a series of points in that shape. We're not actually rendering any particles yet because we haven't defined what the particles look like. So in this next section we have got the particle section, and we define the type of particle, which is the image that is used to render on that point in the base shape, as well as the particle size, the particle color, the particle opacity, that kind of thing. So anything that has to do with the look of the individual particle that's rendered at that point is found in the particle section. So if I wanted to make this orange to make some sort of fire kind of thing, I can do that. But we also have maps that we can map onto the whole thing layer down here. We have quick maps and layer maps, and I'll get to those. But let's get some basic motion here. So we're talking about things like wind and fire. Now, wind, as I mentioned, sort of implies an ephemeral sort of nature, in that particles are going to blow away. Anything that's going to blow off screen and we're not going to worry about anymore is ephemeral. So I wouldn't do a whole lot of wind effects with trapcode form unless I was doing something like a flag. So let's just do the basics of sort of a sheet cloth. So in our base form here, let's go up here and expand the size a little bit. Let's go down to the particle, just set this to white because we're actually going to do an image map of this. And I'll squeeze the particles in just a bit more so we have just about a solid shape here. Okay, so we're going to skip over some of these layer maps and all that and jump to something that you're going to be using a lot with trapcode form, which is the fractal field. Now, I mentioned everything renders in its order, so even though it's very commonly used, it is sort of a little more further down than halfway. So don't mistake that or don't lose it in the crowd here. It's actually a very, very, very important part of trapcode form. So the fractal field is a noise function that exists in 3D space. So it's sort of like fractal noise, but fractal noise that exists in 3D space. And that fractal field is mapped to different parameters, and those parameters are defined by us. So let's try that again. The fractal field section controls how particles are affected by an invisible fractal field. This fractal field is always there, and if I turn this up to say affect the particle size, you start to see what this fractal field can sort of be visualized as. In fact, I'm going to turn the scale up that affects the fractal scale. So basically it's a fractal noise function. It exists in 3D space, so as I move this form back and forth in Z space, we'll see that that fractal field changes quite a bit. So it's not just two-dimensional fractal noise. It's fully three-dimensional. Specifically, it's called Perlin noise if you want to read up on what's going on here. Let's set that to 0. A lot of times what you're going to be using is this displace function and displacing your particles. And this is how we get a lot of these organic shapes that you commonly see with trapcode form. People make backgrounds with these and fantasy user interface elements, you name it. This is the sort of the poster child of form here, this basic shape. So let's start to control this a little bit. I mentioned we'll make something sort of like a flowing flag. So I'm going to flow that fractal noise in the x-axis. And in fact, you notice as I hit play, this is running pretty slowly. I'm going to lower this particle count temporarily so that this flows a lot faster. But I still get a good idea what my fractal field looks like. So there we go. In fact, I think the flow evolution right here is moving a little too quickly. Let me zero that out. Notice that as I hit play, it's sitting there and cycling in place, but the fractal field is evolving, and that's because this flow evolution defaults to 50. So I'm going to set that to a pretty low value and set the flow x to, let's just set this to 100 right now. And actually, let's bring the flow evolution up a little bit more. Starting to get there. Now what we need to do is sort of pin down one side here. Now we can do this by going into the quick maps and picking one of the 3 available maps that we've got. There's an opacity and color map here as well, but these are not going to do what we're looking to do. I need to control that fractal field. So right now everything's being affected equally by the fractal field. So if I can go into map number 1 here and twirl that open, we'll see a map that I can draw on and define values that are more or values that are less. You can see this little up and down thing here, more and less at the bottom. So I can map this to fractal strength, and I'll map it over one axis because we're drawing basically a one-dimensional map here, and trapcode form exists in 3 dimensions. There's a number of preset maps here, so I can just click on that. Now this is not exactly what I want. I'd like this to go the other way, so I can click on flip and have it go that way. Actually, we're getting pretty close. Probably would want to do a real-time preview at this point just to see what our flag looks like. I think it's looking pretty decent. Just to give you a few tips in here, I'm going to set this whole composition to 5 seconds. I can click on flow loop, and this will make a seamless loop of this flag. So if I get to the end, it'll just loop back around, and the fractal field will actually loop upon itself, which is great. Gamma, add, subtract, min, max, f-scale, complexity, octave multiplier, and octave scale are all pretty advanced controls. But the short story is, I won't leave you hanging here, these are all controls that affect the fractal field, and a lot of these you can think of as if that fractal field was just a standard piece of fractal noise. The gamma is the midpoint, the add, subtract basically pushes the black and white values of that fractal noise up or down. The minimum and maximum clamp the values of that fractal field. So you could sort of clamp the blacks of the fractal noise or clamp the whites of the fractal noise. The F scale is simply the fractal scale. The complexity is how many layers of fractal noise we are laying on top of each other to generate the fractal noise, or the fractal field. So we have these sort of larger fractal noise areas, and then we have areas of more detail. We achieve this by layering different layers of fractal noise on top of each other. And the octave multiplier and scale deal with how these different layers are mixed together. That's a bit much to take in right now. Just trying to do the basics of trapcode form here. So let's get into color mapping this. So I'm going to create a comp that kind of matches the size in X and Y of my layer here. So I'm going to make one that's 370 by 200. And let's just go in and go to generate checkerboard. Right, well, I can't get it exact, but we'll call that our flag map that we want to apply. So let's drop this in so we have it. Actually, I need to add a black layer behind it, because I always forget that checkerboard leaves transparency in there. Checkerboard and black. Oh, okay, yeah, that's exactly what I want, because that is behind, and if I solo that, there we go. Okay, so let's turn that off. Go into Trapcode Form, go to Layer Maps. Layer Maps allow us to apply layers in our comp and map them to certain functions in Trapcode Form. Quick maps are internal, so you notice all of these things have internal maps, or maps contained right within the plugin, like this graph here, or color maps that are contained right here, or opacity maps that are defined the same way. So rather than do that, I'm going to apply a color map. So I'm going to map color from the layer flag map. I'm going to map its RGBA, or actually just RGB values, and I'm going to map this. This is a little bit tricky. Again, I mentioned earlier, form is 3 dimensions, and this map here essentially is 2 dimensions. I mean, I know After Effects has 3D space and all that, but once I close this out and bring it in here as an image has 2 dimensions. So I need to map 2 dimensions to the 3 dimensions. So I'm going to map up and down, X and Y. Now, earlier I bumped the number of particles down. So let's squeeze these together to give a nice solid shape. Now, one thing to look out for if you're doing something like this, that where you're trying to sort of replicate an image or project an image onto Trapcode Form layers, is to go into the particle section and change the transfer mode from add to normal, because by default is adding the colors together. That's not going to give you an accurate representation of what you're trying to project onto your image here. So that's the basics of Trapcode Form. There's something you can do with Form that is pretty easy and might be slightly useful for you. This is actually, well, it's sort of a wind theme. But beyond that, getting into things like fire are completely possible. Just have to know a few tricks, and that's what I'm here to show you. So let's do some form fire. And let's apply Trapcode Form. So let's set this to 1 particle in Z and crank up the size and squeeze some of these particles together. So let's go to Fractal Field here and displace this quite a bit. Now you're already starting to see something that looks kind of plasma, I don't know, not quite fire, but it's, well, closer than we were. We're making progress. One thing we want to do is go into this fractal sum here and switch this from noise to absolute noise. The fractal field has positive and negative values. So a value of 0 essentially is neutral gray, and then anytime we go above neutral gray with that imaginary fractal noise layer, that is a positive value, and then anytime we go below gray, we have a negative value. And if we take all those negative values and invert them so that they're all positive, we have something called absolute noise, or, well, yeah, fractal sum. That's, yeah, it's taking an absolute value of all of the values. It's a sort of a math flashback there if you have totally forgotten about absolute values until just this moment. But why that's important to you is that that's how fire tends to behave, or actually look. We have these, well, it sort of doubles up upon themselves. So we can control, well, first of all, we can control the direction here. So let's have it flow upward. So I'm going to go into the flow Y and have this kind of flow in the upward direction. How much flow evolution we want, I'm not quite sure. I'm going to lower it just a little bit. And we also probably want less fractal field affecting the fire down here at the bottom. So let's go into quick maps, set this map to affect fractal strength over the y-axis, and let's draw a quick map like that. Now you can see these little, I did a quick drawing of it with my stylus here, and you can see these little blips in here that sometimes happen. We go right in here into this button that is the smooth button. Hit it a few times to smooth some of those things out. Now, if this isn't exactly where we want this to be, like we want something kind of like this, but I'd actually like to lower it down a little bit, we can offset this map value using the map offset. So if you think of these values like this map, we can take this whole value and drag the whole thing downward and basically offset the map in a downward fashion. Or we can also drag it upward. So because we're defining fractal strength, if I push this upward, we'll have more of the fractal strength being seen. Just a handy thing to have there. Or I can also just go in and draw maybe a cleaner shape. Let's move the overall shape down to the bottom of the screen. And let's size it up so it actually comes closer to the top. Now I'd like to make a little bit of a fade out towards the top here. So I'm going to use a second map for this. Let's go into opacity, map that over white, and I'm going to use a map like this. So it actually has a nice little bell curve fade. And I can drag this down to fade those edges out just a little bit more. So I'm going to define a range of 2 seconds here and just do a quick preview so I can get an idea of my motion in real time. And I think it's actually feeling pretty good. I'm going to give a little bit more displace to this. Maybe more of that flow evolution. Now, obviously, the color is way off. Now, if you've ever watched some of my training, one thing I often say is I like to focus on the motion and movement and behavior of particles before I even think about color mapping, because I think a lot of how selling the look of something like fire, most of it is done in the actual movement and behavior of the particles rather than the look of it. So rather than starting off and doing color maps and all that and focusing on the look of the particle, I focus on the motion first. Now I could go in and just set the color to something orange or whatever, but I think I should probably do more of a color map. So I'm going to go into my quick maps here, color map, map that over the y-axis. Now, certainly don't need a rainbow of colors here. Let's get rid of a few of these. I'll just drag these out until I just have 2 colors that are actually backwards. So there. So I'll make this a little bit yellow to not quite red. Kind of orangish to orangish. This still feels a little on the green side. I'll pull that away from green. Actually, it should be a little hotter towards the bottom, so I'll make that a little bit more white. Okay, now let's go into the fractal or the base form, start squeezing things together. To get a little bit more, and I'm not liking that white towards the bottom. But I think up here we're starting to get that feel of overlapping fire. I'm going to set the particle opacity to a fairly low value like 20 and really crank my particle count. Now, obviously this is going to be lead to higher render times, but once we're starting to get to looking for that realism, smoothing out the particle count is really where it's going to come down to. So that's why I'm leaving this to the last step, because you don't want to be previewing your renders with 2000 by 1200 particles, which is certainly the bottleneck of trapcode form, is the absolute number of particles that you're using. If it's running slow, odds are you've got way too many particles. But I'm starting to wrap up my design here, so I'm thinking we're feeling pretty good, at least for cranking this out in just a few minute lesson. So I'm just trying to express what we're going to be doing and the types of things, and why I think trapcode form is a good way to go when we're in need of very controllable and manipulatable flames. Because one thing we can do is, let me go in here and just draw a basic shape layer. I'm using Roto Bezier, but that's fine. So I've got a shape layer. If I solo that, it looks like that. If we go down here, actually, no, I don't remember if I need it on or off. I'm going to turn it off for now. Let's go to quick maps. And what I can do is actually map the shape of our flame to that shape layer. So let's go to color and alpha, select the shape layer, and map alpha to alpha, and map this over X and Y. Oh, now shape layer, the default size of shape layer is 1280 by 720, and basically the size of my composition. And my size right here is 380 by 730. So let's squeeze this out just a little bit, or stretch it out, I should say. But you can see in sort of a distorted manner that I've got a shape that is going to mimic the shape of my fire, or a shape layer. Oops, let's go back here. Let's lower this particle count too. Now, keep in mind I've also offset this a little bit, so let's move that into the center. So, anyway, getting ahead of myself. If I go in and select these points, or any of these points, and move these around, you can see that my the form is going to follow the shape layer, what I think is pretty useful to have. So, like I was saying, form is a great way to make very customizable either organic shapes or realistic shapes like this. So this is what we'll be doing for things like fire and water, and obviously we'll be using things like particular to add smoke and sparks and that kind of stuff. But in our first lesson, we're actually going to get, or I should say next week's lesson, which will be week 2, we'll get into a basic space ID and start assembling this scene right here. Now, there is a little bit of Cinema 4D. We're certainly not going to model a spaceship. This is actually purchased from TurboSquid, but you'll get a render pass of this. And but there's a lot of particular going on here. There's a lot of there's some trapcode horizon and form creating the star background. The exhaust trails are done with trapcode particular, and there's a mystery plugin right here in this general area that I am not sure if I will be able to show by next class or not, but I will certainly be covering that at some point. I just don't know when. This mystery plugin, I don't know when I'll be able to show that, but I will when I can. So anyway, this is the first one, and this is the second one, the air one, where we'll have some sort of flocking birds and clouds and all kinds of good stuff in here for our fictional Terra network that we'll be creating all kinds of crazy IDs for over the next few weeks. So today I just wanted to cover the basics of form and just give you some practical examples and explain it from another angle that you probably haven't heard it from before. And we'll start next week. We'll assemble this, putting together background with form and doing some particular exhaust and all that kind of stuff. Pretty basic stuff, and we might actually be able to start on some prep work for this one right here. Not quite sure. We'll see how the flow of the class goes. So this is sort of the intro, week 1 primer, so we can hit the ground running. I don't like to start a class with just jumping into a plugin without having started the basics on it. So if we're moving a little slow in week 1, I'll certainly try to pick things up by week 2, now that we have a few basics under our belt. So we'll see you week 2 AFX217. Thanks for joining me.